The main purpose of this presentation tonight is hopefully to stimulate some new and different thinking about lake management. That's really the purpose. I hope you don't feel like you've been given a sales pitch about aeration by the end of this. I hope more so that you feel like you've learned something about why we're pursuing this as a key strategy, what it's intended to do for a lake, and more importantly, what are the larger issues that you ought to be thinking about as a lake property owner in terms of securing a positive future for your lake. So my own personal journey of myself rethinking lake management is unbelievably, it's really the same as Bruce's. It started almost over 10 years ago now when we bought a piece of property on a 160-acre lake in Michigan. 1999, I remember very clearly walking out on the rickety old dock. That experience stuck with me and got me thinking about the larger issues that were affecting our lake. In the meantime, our lake did what all the experts told us we needed to do for Eurasian water milfoil, which was chemically treat it. Can't cut it because it fragments and spreads. At least in Michigan, that's their clear attitude. So we went on a chemical treatment program, got the milfoil under control for a couple of years, but in the meantime, and this happened concurrent to putting my daughter in the water, my gravel shoreline went to a foot and a half of black, smelly ooze. And when that process happened that fast, it got me to rethink lake management a bit and put me on a journey where I went through a learning process, tried to find technologies out there that could really change the game, and in the process of that actually turned it into now my business as well as my passion, which is Lake Savers. So we'll talk, we gave you an introduction to Lake Savers. I'll give you kind of a little bit of facts and figures and what we think our mission is, but really we want to talk about what is the real problem facing lake ecosystems and what is the solution. We call it nature's way to a healthy lake. And yes, it involves aeration, but it's bigger than that. It's not, if I could replace aeration as a tool to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, I'd do it tomorrow. Because putting aeration systems into large lakes and managing them is a tough business. It's a lot of work. But the goal that we're trying to accomplish with that is the right goal. And that's really the main part of what I want to talk about today, and we'll talk about how aeration is a tool toward that goal and what are the goods and what are the bads in that as well. And we'll also share some results. So our mission at Lake Savers is literally to make lakes healthier. We're not trying to manage lakes. We're not trying to manage the symptoms. We're trying to make lakes healthier, period. And do it at a cost that lake associations and lake homeowners can afford to do without expecting the state or the federal government to step in and write a big check. That's our mission. And we believe and we have seen that in a healthy lake, if you can make the lake healthier fundamentally, excess weeds, algae, and muck naturally disappear. We'll talk about why that is. So we've had pretty good progress with this. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see kind of over the last So let's talk about the problem. And this is a great quote that we found by Gil Stern. He's kind of a backyard philosopher. Man is a complex being. He makes deserts bloom and lakes die. And the facts on that is that as we fertilize farms and lawns, we fertilize lakes and rivers and oceans and all the way up. And what has happened as a result of that overfeeding, over-fertilization, we spread phosphorus and nitrogen on the land to grow crops and grass. Lakes are holes. When it rains, everything flows to the hole. So we overfeed the lake. We actually are turning lake bottoms into compost piles of nutrients, partially decayed organic matter that fundamentally change the lake ecosystem. I think we all know this, right? The same fertilizers we use to grow food and lawns turn lakes green with weeds and algae. And as these weeds and algae bloom and die and sink to the bottom, if the lake doesn't have the capacity to break all of that dead material down fast enough, the lake becomes a compost pile. So what we like to say is that, and the proof is in the pudding, if you want to address a weed or algae problem, if you want to try and solve this problem, you really need to get rid of this. You need to get rid of the compost pile. So here are some facts that we like to talk about in terms of muck being really the problem. Muck really is half decayed weed and algae. It's plant material. It's also the leaves and the grass clippings and everything else organic that goes into the lake during the course of a year and years and then decades. This muck that sits at the bottom of the lake under the right conditions can literally release nutrients into the water and fertilize weed and algae growth. And also, if you've noticed, and we've correlated this on several lakes that we work with, in terms of if you look at an aquatic vegetation survey of a lot of the lakes that we work with that have a milfoil problem, and you also then map the lake bottom sediments based on their organic composition, meaning where's it the muckiest versus sand or gravel or less mucky areas. The heaviest milfoil growth almost always correlates to where the muck is the most organic, the most nutrient rich. So even the rooted plants get a lot of their nutrients from this nutrient rich muck that sits on the bottom, and that's where they like to grow. That's where they do best and grow the thickest. In fact, milfoil gets 90% of its nutrients from the lake bottom muck through the roots. Here's the other key thing, is that everybody's concerned about watershed management, and that's right to be. But what doesn't get talked about enough is the fact that on many, many lakes, in fact most lakes that have serious weed and algae problems, they're down the scale in terms of being late mesotrophic or even eutrophic, the majority of their nutrients on an annual basis isn't new stuff coming into the lake from the watershed. It's nutrients that get released from this compost pile back into the water to grow that year's weeds and algae. And finally, if you don't have a way of getting rid of that muck, you're fighting a losing battle against weeds and algae. No matter how fast you kill them, if the nutrients are there, algae in particular is a very strong competitor. It can come back really fast. And it's really, as you'll see in a minute, kind of a no-win game. So just to kind of put a picture on this, this is what we call, and really is commonly called, the lake fertilization cycle. Fertilizers flow into the lake from the watershed, and lakes were meant to be in balance with the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen that's available in the Earth's crust. And they're trace elements in the Earth's crust. But because we need to eat, we mine phosphorus out of the ground and manufacture and mine nitrogen as well and convert it into ammonia, fertilizer, and we spread it on the earth, the surface of the earth. So we take what's buried underground, away from lakes, can't get to a lake when it's under the ground, spread it on the earth, and then as it rains, let that stuff washes into the lake, and it overfeeds the lake, leading to the start of excess weed and algae growth. As that weed and algae dies, either naturally or because we kill it with herbicides and sinks to the bottom, it starts to decompose. And it'll actually decompose fairly quickly if there's oxygen at the bottom to allow the right kind of little critters, bacteria, to eat it and convert it into more bacteria and carbon dioxide and water. But if there's too much going down to the bottom and the oxygen runs out before that's consumed, that's when you start to build the compost pile. And in fact, what happens is, once the oxygen runs out, all of the good, what we call the good bacteria, aerobic oxygen-using bacteria, die, and then anaerobic bacteria take over. Those are bacteria that don't require oxygen to survive. And the problem with the anaerobic bacteria is they work about 30 times slower than aerobic bacteria, and they produce some pretty nasty side byproducts: ammonia, methane, hydrogen sulfide. That's why if you're in many lakes, if you grab a handful of that muck from the bottom in the middle of the summer, if it smells bad, like rotten eggs or like sewer gas, that's because the same process that is operating in a septic tank is operating at a lake bottom. And you wind up with a situation like this where this overfeeding stimulates this cycle in a lake of excess weed growth, piling that stuff on the bottom. The lake can't break it down fast enough because it runs out of oxygen, and you pile layer after layer of compost at the bottom of the lake, creating a bigger storehouse or bank of nutrients to fuel the next season's weed growth. Does this look like a somewhat familiar picture to some folks in terms of what might be happening in your lake? It's exactly what's happening and been happening in my lake. And so we like to say that a lake bottom without oxygen is no different than the bottom of a septic tank. The same biological processes are going on that lake bottom of the breakdown of organic material by anaerobic, non-oxygen requiring bacteria. Same process of the lake bottom as a septic tank. The only difference is the source of waste in the lake bottom is actually organic plant material for the most part, unless you have a lot of geese, then you got a little animal material there too, whereas in a septic tank it's human or animal waste. So unfortunately, and this was a big light bulb moment for me, when I realized that basically large parts of my lake for large parts of the summer was essentially water on top of a septic tank, that got me a little bit anxious about the property I owned and how long it was going to stay in a condition that provided the kind of recreational opportunities and aesthetic opportunities that I think we all want to live around a lake. What I think are some key questions that every lake homeowner should ask, and maybe even open up to see if there's any comments or questions that you might have on what we've been through so far. One key question is, what percent of the nutrient loading in your lake is internal loading from the compost pile versus external loading? If you've got a lake consultant or the city or the watershed district doing studies on your lake, ask them and push them to figure out what the internal loading factor is on your lake. Hopefully they'll know what you're talking about. I think they will. It's not that easy to do. You got to push them to do it. That's an important thing to know. If you've got a watershed management program in place, how effective is it? If it's being city sponsored or watershed district sponsored, ask them to tell you how many pounds of phosphorus and nitrogen they're preventing from getting to your lake every year. You need to know that so you know whether or not all the money they're spending on that is a good investment or not. Watershed management is good, it's necessary, it's important, but it's difficult as hell. And over 30 years, 50 years, there's been billions upon billions of dollars spent on watershed management programs across the country, and yet by anyone's definition, every aquatic environment in the country is getting worse. So somewhere we're not doing a good enough job with watershed management to make a real difference. Does our lake run out of oxygen at the bottom in the summer and in the winter? Key question. We'll talk more about the importance of oxygen later, but that's a key indicator of whether or not your lake is able to keep up with the nutrient load that exists in the compost pile and that's coming in each year from the watershed. And then finally, how much money is being spent on reducing nutrient loading in our lake versus managing symptoms, i.e. killing weeds? And when I say reducing nutrient loading, I'm talking about either internal or external. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because reducing nutrient loading is an investment in your lake. Every pound of phosphorus you can take out or prevent from going in your lake is an investment in that lake's future and is making it healthier. Killing weeds or even cutting weeds and hauling them out, although if you cut enough you are getting some phosphorus out, typically is not an investment because it's really not reducing the nutrients that's the root cause of the problem. So 4 questions that I hope will be helpful for you. Any comments or questions on what we've kind of talked about so far?